We're ready to move on to our first panel, which is the making of a crisis and the road ahead, with Monique Morrissey from the Economic Policy Institute and Judy Beard, who's the legislative and political director at the APWU. So Monique, you'll lead us off. The floor is yours.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm Monique Morrissey of the Economic Policy Institute. I'm also a union member, so very thrilled to be among other brothers and sisters, and the great-granddaughter of a village postmistress. And the Postal Service is very dear to my heart. I'm going to be distilling a very long report. I will share my screen so you can see the link to it. I'm going to go very fast because I have 8 minutes. But if you want to get more into the weeds, you can always go and check out the original report. Let me see, share screen. Can I share my screen? Let's see. Maybe I won't be sharing my screen. Let's see. Share. Okay, I think, can everybody see that?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so Judy is going to talk more about the specifics of the legislation, the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act of 2006. So we're coming up on 15 years of this act. And I think most people on this call, if they're aware of it, think that at least most of it should be dismantled. But the PAEA didn't come out of nowhere, and it has persisted for 15 years, even though virtually the year after it passed, it became apparent that it was causing serious problems, including even sort of neutral observers like the Congressional Research Service were pointing out some serious flaws in the PAEA. But it was a long time coming, and it has persisted for 15 years. And that leads us to ask, why is the Postal Service a perpetual battleground, and what are the forces at play that got us here? And so that's what I'll be talking about. And I think Judy is going to talk more specific about, about Congress and specific legislation. And I'm going to take a very big picture view of this. Infamously, the PAEA introduced onerous retiree health benefit pre-funding requirement, basically requiring the Postal Service to fund 75 years worth of retiree health benefits in the space of 10 years. It also limited price increases on postage at a time when the number of addresses that needed to be serviced were increasing, but paper mail volume was declining. And it formally restricted the Postal Service to traditional activities like postal delivery, selling stamps, and prevented it from doing things that we're going to talk about later in this summit, like offering financial services or enhanced financial services. And all of these things were detrimental to the Postal Service, and we need to change them. So why is the Postal Service perpetually seem to be under attack? One, it's very big. It's the biggest civilian agency. Two, it's very popular, always leads, top lists of the most popular federal agencies. And this is bipartisan, and it's especially popular in rural districts. And three, and most importantly, I think what I'm going to talk about is it competes with the private sector. And so basically there are these special interests that want to dismantle it in whole or in part, and that is a toxic mix. So you have very big, it's got a target on its back, it's very popular. So people who are against government want to make it look bad, and it competes with private sector interests. So we can call the private sector interests and anti-government ideologues an unholy alliance. This is what Teddy Roosevelt once called them, I think in 1912. He also mentioned that some of this unholy alliance often works in secret, and this happens also with the Postal Service. So we all have our eyes on the dismantling aspects of the PAEA and other changes, but there's also things that go on behind the scenes. For example, these special interests often work in special advisory councils behind the scenes in closed door meetings with even postal management to influence the Postal Service. Why is there an ideological vendetta against the Postal Service? what Teddy Roosevelt talked about is basically just corruption, that politicians are corrupt and they're in league with big money. But I actually believe that when it comes to the Postal Service, there are true believers. So some other people will talk later about privatization attempts through libertarian think tanks. I think some of those people are sincere. I also think that members of my profession, economists, often assume that the markets work better than government. And some of the public believes this too. And this is one of the reasons the PAEA was especially pernicious, because it caused the Postal Service to lose money and then to appear like it was broken or inefficient. And this gets repeated even by neutral observers, even people who don't have an animus or aren't anti-Postal Service, but they just believe there's something inherently wrong with the Postal Service, as opposed to that the Postal Service is operating with severe constraints that no other public or private organization is operating under. Why are libertarians opposed to the Postal Service when it's not taxpayer funded? What are their problems? Well, they have all kinds of, and I go into this in my report, all kinds of pseudo reasons. Legitimately, they could say, well, the Postal Service is a monopoly, and so that could be they could charge higher prices than they need to, or not be as efficient as they need to be. And also the very fact that they have single pricing creates distortions in the market. And again, people like economists, certain kinds of economists, are big believers that the market should operate as much as possible in an unfettered way. But the problem is that the markets only work really well, and this is also, again, in theory, when they're very competitive. There's nothing about the sphere in which the Postal Service operates or its competitors and its customers that is competitive. These are not competitive markets. Delivery systems are natural monopolies. There are high fixed costs, there are barriers to entry, there are network efficiencies. Under any circumstances, it would have to be heavily regulated, even if it was a private sector entity, as it is in some European countries. It also is a statutory monopoly, and this is a long history, and this is an international thing, that governments have given postal services monopolies in order to make sure that underserved areas like rural areas get services, and also to expand the network throughout the country when they're for nation building purposes. So this is not unique to the United States. You could theoretically have a private postal service and you could regulate it heavily, but there's no particular advantage to it, because if you think the government is inefficient, it's going to be an inefficient regulator. You might as well just do it directly. But I think that what most of the people on this call, and I myself agree with, is that more importantly than all those sort of theoretical reasons why it should be a public service, is that the public postal service is too important to leave to self-interest, to private sector, to money-making entities. We believe it should be a democratic public service for fairness reasons. People's ability to take advantage of these services shouldn't depend on their ability to pay. The cost shouldn't reflect the cost if you live in Kotzebue, Alaska, or you shouldn't have to pay more. And also because these are positions of public trust, and this will be fleshed out much more by other panelists later on, but we really trust postal workers to do their jobs for reasons other than self-interest. And that trust is very important in postal service. Who are these special interests that are always at war, or at least trying to nibble away at the Postal Service? They're major customers, they're major competitors, and increasingly they're both customers and competitors. So when you think of customers, you might have thought in the old days it would have been Sears Roebuck. Major competitors, you might have thought in the old days it's UPS. But really what we're looking at now is mostly something like Amazon, which has its own delivery network, but is also a major customer. So these companies like Amazon, they're not operating in competitive environments, and they have every incentive to meddle with the Postal Service to try to influence the legislation, to try to influence regulation, and try to influence management practices behind the scenes through advisory groups, through industry advisory groups. Sorry. And counter to these, I realize I'm sort of running out of time, but I will just say very quickly, what we have to push back against these special interests are households, small businesses, and workers. These interests are more diffuse, but they do have representation. Households have representation in Congress, especially rural areas, which are disproportionately represented in Congress, which is usually a bad thing, but in terms of protecting the Postal Service, it's a good thing. Small business associations, I think they're kind of weak, but they function. And the most important of all are workers and unions. And again, I'm a proud member of a union. I think but I think that unions have historically taken too much of the job of having to defend the Postal Service, which is why this Grand Alliance is so important. very quickly, critics will tend to frame the issue as government inefficiency or unfair competition. These are somewhat contradictory. The critiques are addressed to different groups of people. The unfair competition is usually something that's told to regulators. Government inefficiency is something that they try to convince the public is happening when the Postal Service fails. Fortunately, we've seen that even with a saboteur like the current Postmaster General, the general public is so in love with this Postal Service that they see through this. So even with, that they don't really believe that the Postal Service is inefficient or bad, but this is an ongoing attempt to make the Postal Service look bad. So are we safe from these problems? Are critics shouting into the wind? We'll hear more in the future about how there have been attempts by the Trump administration and many predecessors to formally privatize the Postal Service, to just go, there was a special task force to talk about privatizing the Postal Service. And a lot of times these things happen, and then afterwards we think, well, it hasn't happened. Phew, we're safe. It's too popular. There doesn't have any public support. What I want to leave you with is that it's very important to look not just at how overt attempts to privatize the public sector, including the Postal Service, Social Security, and other beloved public institutions, but covert, behind the scenes, or backdoor attempts to do the same. So you can have these frontal assaults on the Postal Service fail, and at the same time, you could have a lot of outsourcing and shrinking of the Postal Service that's happening behind the scenes through the influence of these special interests. And that is what we need to be more aware of and more cautious of. And I think one good way to do that is to have a prospective and visionary agenda. And that is what this People's Postal Service Summit is about. And I look forward to participating more and hearing more about these visionary and proactive rather than just defensive agenda. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Monique. That's such helpful historical context and background, and good words of wisdom for moving forward and how to be cautious as we advance. So next up, we have Judy Beard. Judy, go ahead. It's your floor.
Thank you, Erica. First, I would like to extend a thanks to the Grand Alliance to Save Our Public Postal Service. Our APWU members are proud that we were one of the building organizations. We are fighting alongside all of you to keep the United States Mail the People's Post Office. I have been asked to focus on its mission, function, some challenges, share some good news, and our current legislation text. The mission of the Postal Service is to provide the nation with reliable, affordable, universal mail service. Its function is spelled out in Section 101 of Title 39 of the U.S. Code. And it states that its obligation is to bind the nation together to provide prompt and reliable and efficient services. Now, we know today the mail is not prompt, it's not reliable, but we're going to talk a little bit about why that is happening. The USPS delivers everywhere in this country, 157 million addresses, no matter who we are or where we live. Our challenges dated back to the creation of the United States Postal Service. It was first the Post Office Department back in 1775, but with the passage of the Postal Reorganization Act of 1970, our troubles continued to build. We became self-supporting, self-funding, owned by the federal government, and required to financially break even. We paid our bills faithfully from the sale of our product. In the Postal Reorganization Act of 1970, they also established the Postal Regulatory Commission and the Postal Board of Governors. We have some good news. We know about the Postal Board of Governors. They're the ones that selected the Postmaster General under the law. We know that our President of the United States have nominated 3 additional members to the Postal Board of Governors. And that's good. That's good that we'll have a full board soon. And the board takes the responsibility to make some serious decisions. In the 116th Congress, the United States Fairness Act, HR 2882, was introduced by Representative DeFazio. And Monique mentioned that the PAEA, Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act, established this law in 2006, established a requirement for the Postal Service to make this pre-funding that is ridiculous of retiree health care. 75 years out. That's how ridiculous. At over $5 billion a year, Post Office could not pay that after 2012. And this HR, this bill, HR 2382, the USPS Fairness Act, it was introduced in the House, it passed in the House, but it didn't just pass by one party. It passed with 309 votes, yes, and 106 no. And 87 Republicans voted for this US Fairness Act of HR 2382. It's important because we knew that the post office is not a party issue. It's a people's issue, regardless of what party you belong to. And just recently, in the 117th Congress, the USPS Fairness Act has already been introduced, but it was introduced in a different way than most bills are introduced. The original signatures came up to 248 the day it was introduced, with bipartisan support. The same day or a day later, the Senate bill was introduced, and the Senate bill is S-145. So the House bill is HR 695 in this Congress, and the Senate bill is Senate Bill 145. So with that kind of bipartisan support, to try to relieve the Postal Service of that $5 billion a year that they, were required to pay and stopped paying in 2012, is really good, because the post office books shows over $80 billion worth of debt, but 83% of it is because $80 billion worth of debt because of the PAEA. And 80% of that debt is because of the Postal Enhancement and Accountability and Enhancement Act, the pre-funding requirement that nobody else has to pay, that the post office paid as you go prior to that, and it's totally ridiculous to be paying 75 years out before people are born. We've had other victories. We had a victory in December when the relief bill passed, giving the Postal Service an opportunity not to pay back the $10 billion that was in the CARES Act that passed last March, not to pay it back. And instead of the $10 million that we did not have to pay back, we knew that House bills had passed saying that the Postal Service should get $25 billion COVID related. And when the bill passed in December, we heard many members of Congress and many legislators say that that was just a down payment. So we would like to see the additional funding for the Postal Service. There are a couple other things that we would like to see. In an infrastructure bill, we would like to see $25 billion for the Postal Service. That will help the Postal Service not only pay for, more vehicles, it will also help the Postal Service remodel some of the post offices that exist today, and maybe even add, ATM machines at business centers with computers in it. There's an appropriation bill coming up, and we know that the mail is slow. We know why it's slow. One of the reasons is COVID related. A lot of our employees are off work. Some of it deals with managers making bad decisions. So there's a lot of reasons why the mail is slow. A lot of employees never got replaced after they retired. So in the appropriations bill coming up in the House, we hope that they put language in there for improving the service standards, as well as some money in it for a pilot program for postal banking or postal financial services. Recently, the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, chaired by Representative Carolyn Maloney, Chairwoman Carolyn Maloney, she introduced a document called a discussion paper. And that discussion paper is similar to a postal reform bill, but it hasn't got that far yet. It's like the first step of the postal reform bill. And in it, it has language in it on service standards, on Medicare integration, and it has the Usps Fairness Act on the pre-funding of the retiree health care. And it's a bill that all four postal unions are looking at. It's not a bill, it's a discussion document that all four postal unions are looking at. And we're going to make some suggestions to her committee on improvements to it. I'd like to end by letting you know that we still need your help. We still need money for the Postal Service. It is the people's post office, and we will keep it that way. Thank you.
Next up, we have a question from Jamie Partridge. Go ahead, Jamie.
Hi, Jamie Partridge, retired letter carrier and organizer with Communities and Postal Workers United. I have a question for either Judy Beard or Mark Dimmenstein with the American Postal Workers Union. I know you're going into a contract campaign in this coming year, and in the past, you've raised issues like postal banking or other issues related to the common good. And some of the things that we've talked about this morning. And I'm wondering what is your thinking going into this period about the kind of issues related to the common good, the public in the contract campaign negotiations, and how can the public be part of pushing postal management to do the right thing?
I'm not personally involved in the contract campaign. However, in the legislative area, we are going to be working toward getting pilots in post offices. Right now, the House is looking at including in their appropriations bill $2 million for the post office. I believe that's going to be introduced. It was introduced in the last House in the 116th Congress, and it didn't go anywhere. But there have been meetings continuously, not a campaign, but meetings trying to get the post office pilot programs going. We believe that once those pilot programs are going successfully, then it's no reason why they wouldn't be nationwide.
This is postal banking you're talking about?
Yes.
Great.
So thank you. I think we've hit our questions. I'm going to give it a moment to see if there are any other outstanding questions. And if not, we will move on. And seeing no hands. Great. Well, thank you all. Before moving on, just another round of thanks to our fantastic panelists. Actually, a final question before we shift out. Maybe Judy or Monique or Sarah, if you could talk about sort of what some of the opposition is, what's standing in the way of some of the proposals you've laid out that we want to be able to move forward with now. Now that we're moving from the defensive stance, but now that we have a more proactive posture, what's in our way? What do we need to look out for? So Judy or Monique or Sarah.
So some of the things that are standing in the way are people, members of Congress. The Postal Service needs money to do some of these things, and if they could get the money that they need in infrastructure, or if they can get the money that they need through, any type of resolution, then they could get, more things done for the Postal Service. And if they took service standards very serious, because right now, if people can't get their medicine, if the mail is so slow, we're going to lose business. So we have to do everything we can to increase the service standards, to give the people what they deserve.
I could say a couple more things about that. I mean, I think throughout the Postal Service history, when it has done these incredible innovations, there have been private, like self-interests that have tried to block them. And I've looked into the history of the introduction of the parcel post, and companies like Wells Fargo Express saw this as competition for them and tried to block it. Today, we couldn't imagine the country without the Postal Service delivering packages. So it was, Congress stood strong on that one and came through with it. Today, we're seeing the big banks trying to oppose postal banking or expansion of postal financial services because they see it as competition, even though they have neglected a lot of these communities for years and aren't providing services in a lot of low-income communities. And then again, what Judy said about the money, when the Postmaster General testified recently and said that he would only commit to 10% of the new vehicles for the Postal Service to be electric, he said it was because of money, and that if Congress came through with additional funding. And I think there's one where we need to look at the cost of not transforming the vehicle fleet, because the cost of climate change plus all of the the fuel and other costs associated with the fossil fuel vehicles that they have now is going to be much bigger than biting the bullet now and really transforming the fleet to be heavily electric.
Thanks, Sarah. Monique, did you have anything to add to Judy's and Sarah's comments?
No, I completely agree with both of them. I just wanted to say that also it's been our experience that the industries that feel threatened will go blazes against any suggestion, whether it's modest or large. So you might as well go large, because you're going to get the same reaction whether or not you're trying to tiptoe around them or really actually threaten their business interests. So and this has been the case for many different similar initiatives.
Great advice there, Monique. Thank you. Yes, might as well go large, right? So yeah.